plan. And in the court of Delhi, a new sultan was crowned amid rumors of treachery, murder, and betrayal. Muhammad bin Tughlaq was an enigmatic and mercurial ruler. On one hand, he was an intellectual, an expert in the Quran and Islamic law, who could speak Persian, Arabic, Turkish, and Sanskrit, as well as a famous lover of poetry. Like all the sultans of Delhi, he was a Muslim, but was mostly tolerant of other religions, and was the only sultan recorded to have taken part in his people's Hindu festivals. But he also had a much darker side. Muhammad bin Tughlaq's father had come from humble origins, the son of a slave and a Hindu mother, but he had risen to power and founded the Tughlaq dynasty. But then, only 5 years into his reign, a freak accident occurred. The Sultan was sitting under a pavilion with his favourite son and the intended crown prince, when, without warning, the structure collapsed, crushing them both to death. In some sources, the event is attributed to a bolt of lightning striking the pavilion. One scholar of the time, named Barani, describes the event in the following terms.
A thunderbolt from the sky descended upon the earth, and the roof under which the Sultan was seated fell down, crushing him and 5 or 6 other persons, so that they died.
But the Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta, who visited the Delhi Sultanate during this time, and wrote his account once he was safely back in his home city of Fez, gives a different version of the story. He claims that the pavilion collapse was planned, an assassination orchestrated by the king's younger son, who would go on to take the throne, Muhammad bin Tughlaq.
The scheme was that whenever the elephants would tread on one side of it, the whole building would fall in ruins. The Sultan alighted, and his son asked his permission to parade the elephants before him. And the elephants were led up from one direction as was planned. And when they walked on that side, the pavilion fell in on the Sultan and his son Mahmud. Muhammad bin Tughlaq gave orders to fetch axes and mattocks in order to dig for them, but he made a sign to delay, and in consequence they were not brought out until after sunset. They cleared away the ruins and found the Sultan dead, with his back bent over his son to protect him.
As with many rulers who came to power through treachery, Muhammad bin Tughlaq would spend his reign in a state of deep paranoia, always afraid that someone else would do the same thing to him. And throughout his time on the throne, he would dole out extremely harsh punishments to those who displeased him. The traveller Ibn Battuta was shocked by his harsh treatment of his citizens.
The Sultan was far too free in shedding blood. He used to punish small faults and great, without respect of persons, whether men of learning or piety, or noble descent. Every day there are brought to the audience hall hundreds of people, chained, pinioned, and fettered, and those who are for execution are executed, those for torture are tortured, and those for beating are beaten.
The chronicler Firishtar goes even further.
So little did he hesitate to spill the blood of God's creatures, that one might have supposed his object was to exterminate the human species altogether. No single week passed without his having put to death one or more of the learned and holy men who surrounded him, or some of the secretaries who attended him.
This cruel streak would earn him the name Muhammad Kuni, or Muhammad the Bloody. Intriguingly, Tughlaq was also a passionate reformer, and was determined to enact a sweeping series of modernization policies in the Sultanate. But each and every one of these was a disaster. Perhaps inspired by China, he introduced the use of copper coins to replace the old silver ones, to make the economy less vulnerable to fluctuations in the supply of silver. But these copper coins were very easy to counterfeit, and people across the Sultanate began melting down the copper objects in their homes to turn them into coins. The value of the new currency soon crashed, and the silver coins had to be reintroduced at enormous cost. I think it's not unreasonable to assume that Mohammed bin Tughlaq actually suffered from some kind of mental illness. One report by the Portuguese writer and traveller Fernão Nunes recounts a popular story about him.
There are tales of him which do indeed seem most marvellous of the things that he did. As, for instance, how he made ready an army because one day in the morning, while standing dressing at a window which was closed, a ray of sun came into his eyes, and he cried out that he would not rest until he had killed or vanquished whomsoever had dared to enter his apartments while he was dressing. All his nobles could not dissuade him from his purpose, even though they told him it was the sun that had done it, a thing without which they could not live, that it was a celestial thing and was located in the sky, and that he could never do any harm to it. With all this, he made his forces ready, saying that he must go in search of his enemy. And as he was going along with large forces raised in the country, so much dust arose that it obscured the sun. When he lost sight of it, the captains told him that he had put to flight him who he had come to seek. Content with this, the king returned to the road, saying that since his enemy had fled, he was satisfied.
While some of these stories have the sound of apocryphal folk tales, it's clear that the king who inspired them was indecisive and unstable. At one point, he apparently raised an army of 100,000 men and marched it up into the Himalayas, where it was easily ambushed and cut off by the Hindu tribes who lived there. It's recorded that only a single horseman made it back to Delhi to tell of the army's fate. One of the most devastating decisions he took was to relocate his capital. He decided that Delhi was too vulnerable to attack by Mongols and other steppe peoples, and so he would move his capital to the city of Devagiri, more than 1,200 kilometers to the south. He ordered that every citizen of Delhi should relocate and make the long journey by road. Accounts recall that thousands died on the way. The traveller Ibn Battuta arrived in Delhi around this time and remembers finding it a deserted ghost town.
The Sultan ordered all the inhabitants to quit the city of Delhi and made a proclamation stating that should any person whatsoever be found in any of its houses or streets, they should receive punishment. Upon this, they all went out. When I entered Delhi, it was almost a desert.
Battuta relates that during this time, the king climbed onto the roof of his palace and saw the city empty, its streets silent, with no smoke rising from its chimneys. Then he sighed and said the following:
Now my heart is satisfied, and my feelings are appeased.
Characteristically for Mohammed bin Tughlaq, soon after the mass relocation of Delhi had been completed, he changed his mind, and much of the city's population was forced to march all the way back. But to the people of the south, the Sultan's failed attempt to move his capital in their direction can't have passed without notice. It must have been clear that the ambitions of the Sultans were now moving ever closer towards them. And by this time, the power of the Delhi Sultanate was seemingly unstoppable. Its empire continued to grow, even through the 26-year reign of this temperamental king. The Sultans swallowed up the South Indian people known as the Kakatiyas, and other surrounding Hindu kingdoms, until the empire's territory reached its largest extent around the year 1335. It would now stretch for thousands of kilometers, form a belt across India from sea to sea, and nearly encompass the entire peninsula. But this success was not to last. The mad Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq died in the year 1351, while out on campaign to crush a Turkic tribe in the mountains of Pakistan. The exact cause of his death is unknown, but one scholar of the time reported the news with the following quip.
The Sultan was rid of the people, and the people of the Sultan.
But despite his erratic and tyrannical ruling style, it's clear that something in the harsh character of Muhammad bin Tughlaq had been acting to hold the empire together. After his death, the Sultanate of Delhi began to disintegrate, and all its newly conquered lands rose up in rebellion. Soon a war of succession tore the Delhi Sultanate into multiple factions, with nobles across the empire setting up their own states and declaring freedom. The year 1345 is the last year that imperial coins were minted in South India. The following years saw the empire devolve into anarchy and disintegration, and opportunist enemies waiting behind the mountains to the north soon got word of this. One of those enemies was the Turco-Mongolian warlord and emperor known as Timur, the last of the great nomadic conquerors of the Eurasian steppe. After hearing of the weakness of the Delhi Sultanate, Timur marched his army south to Delhi in the year 1398, plundering and killing all the way. When he reached the city, he utterly sacked it, looted it, and put its people to the sword. Estimates for the casualties in this massacre go as high as 200,000 people. Timur himself would later write the following slightly unconvincing account of the atrocity.
There was likewise an immense loot of rubies, diamonds, garnets, pearls, and other gems, vessels of gold and silver, and brocades and silks of great value. Excepting the quarter of the Sayyids, the scholars, and the other Muslimans, the whole city was sacked. The pen of fate had written down their destiny for the people of this city. Although I was desirous of sparing them, I could not succeed, for it was the will of God that this calamity should befall the city.
Timur had no intention of staying in India. He simply collected up all the wealth he could loot, along with countless enslaved people, particularly skilled artisans, and returned to his capital of Samarkand in modern Uzbekistan. Like the sacking of Rome, Timur's sack of Delhi tore the heart out of this already struggling empire. The dynasties that followed had no ability to maintain their far-flung territories, and would now be little more than local warlords. The people and lands that had once been part of the empire were left in a state of anarchy, chaos, and plague. It was a time of immense change, a time of terrible suffering, and for some, a time of enormous opportunity. Into this terrain of blood and fire, two brothers would rise from obscure upbringings to change the shape of power in this region. And it's with these two brothers that the story of Vijayanagara would truly begin. They would move the center of Indian power from the Muslim north to the Hindu south, and build a city there that would stand among the great cities of the medieval world. They were known as the Sangama brothers, and their names were Bukka and Harihara. The exact origins of the Sangama brothers are wreathed in mystery. Many historians believe that Bukka and Harihara were commanders of the southern Hoysala Empire. According to these accounts, they may have been stationed on the rocky banks of the Tungabhadra River, with orders to repel any Muslim incursions from the north. Some more dramatic and fanciful stories recount how the brothers were generals of the conquered Kakatiyas, captured as prisoners of war and taken to Delhi, where they were forced to convert to Islam, later escaping and converting back to their native faiths. But none of this is mentioned in contemporary sources, meaning that these accounts are likely unreliable. Many of these legends suggest that these brothers met a Hindu sage named Sri Vidyaranya. One traditional story recalls that Harihara was out hunting one day when he saw a miraculous sight, and the sage advised him on how to interpret it, as the historian Robert Sewell recounts.
During his reign, this chief was one day hunting amongst the mountains south of the river, when a hare, instead of fleeing from his dogs, flew at them and bit them. The king, astonished at this marvel, was returning homewards lost in meditation, when he met on the riverbank the sage named Vidyaranya, or Forest of Learning, who advised the chief to found a city on the spot. And so the king did, and on that very day began work on his houses, and he enclosed the city round about.
While this is most likely a fable, it does contain an illuminating image of how the young power of Vijayanagara would go on to see itself as a hunted rabbit who had turned around and learned how to bite. As the power of the Delhi Sultanate collapsed, the two brothers, Bukka and Harihara, raised a considerable army, made up of angry Hindu lords, but also large cohorts of Muslim mercenaries. These may even have been soldiers who had once fought for the Delhi Sultanate, but who were no longer getting paid. With this force, the brothers set out to capture the areas of South India that the Sultanate had left behind. Their offer to Hindu lords in the region was clear: join us and we will ensure that South India is run by Hindus. And it's clear that many found this offer irresistible. Within only a few decades, the Sangama brothers had brought a large part of South India under their control, but many areas in the south were still ruled by Muslim powers, now cut off and isolated. These included the arid lands of Tamil Nadu, India's southernmost state, which was still ruled by a short-lived Muslim power continuing to fight for its existence in South India, known as the Madurai Sultanate. At this time, the Sangama brother Bukka was on the throne, and his wife was a woman named Ganga Devi, a famed poet. She wrote one vaulting epic poem in the language of Sanskrit, entitled Madura Vijayam, or The Victory of Madurai. In it, she describes how a woman from the holy city of Madurai comes to King Bukka's court and begs him to take the town back. She describes how the ancient Hindu temples of Madurai had fallen into disrepair under its Muslim rulers.
White ants have destroyed the doors. The door frame of the sanctum is broken due to the wild growth of trees, plants, and creepers. The temple premises that formerly echoed the soft beating of the drums are now full of wild, wallowing jackals. The place once filled with the odor of sacrificial smoke and the melodious chant of Vedic mantras is now full of the foul smell of meat. The beautiful line of statues that adorn the tall towers of the beautiful buildings in the city are now covered with layers of cobwebs.
Whether truly motivated by these religious concerns or not, the Sangama brothers marched south and quickly conquered the now isolated Madurai Sultanate. With the southern Tamil country now under their control, the Sangama brothers now ruled over a large and wealthy territory. They returned to their former post on the rocky granite banks of the Tungabhadra River. It was an unassuming sight, just a small and fairly insignificant village, known only for its shrine to Shiva, a focal point of pilgrimage. But here they began to build a city that would announce in its size and ambition the arrival of a new, confident power in the south of India. They named this city Vijaya Nagara, from the Sanskrit Vijaya, meaning victory, and Nagara, meaning city, the city of victory. The city that the Sangamas built on the banks of the Tungabhadra River testified to the ambitions that they held for their new kingdom. It would be a city of soaring temples and wide avenues, built with an impressive grasp of urban planning. But the city was also a testament to the dangerous world that they now found themselves at the heart of. They would build Vijayanagara as a formidable fortress. The impassable granite hills already provided excellent defence, while the wide, torrential Tungabhadra River protected it on the north side, almost impossible for an army to ford. The brothers enhanced these natural defences by fortifying the passes between the hills with strong gates and towers, and these massive walls can still be traced in the landscape today, enclosing an area of more than 650 square kilometres. The Afghan envoy Abdur Razak, who visited in the 15th century, wrote the following description of the city.
It is built in such a manner that 7 citadels and the same number of walls enclose each other. The 7th fortress, which is placed in the centre of the other, occupies an area 10 times larger than the marketplace of the city of Herat. It is the place which is used as the residence of the king.
These walls were manned by soldiers who watched from the ramparts, operating watch posts on the broad roads that ran in and out of the city. And in between the layers of walls were areas filled with boulders known as horse stones, designed to disrupt the movement of cavalry and guarantee that any attacking army would have a difficult time advancing, while the soldiers of Vijayanagara rained arrow fire down on their heads. And when you look at the situation that surrounded the city and the new empire of Vijayanagara, it's not hard to see why these defensive fortifications were considered necessary. That's because the collapse of the Delhi Sultanate had left a number of fragmented kingdoms behind, who, like Vijayanagara, rose out of the chaos of the collapsing empire. And the most powerful of these in South India was the society known as the Bahmani Sultanate. According to tradition, the Bahmani Sultanate was founded by an army commander named Zafar Khan, who had served under the erratic Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq. It's clear that at some point he felt the waning power of the Delhi Sultanate in its final years, and in the year 1347 declared himself an independent king in South India, seizing a large portion of the rocky Deccan Plateau for himself. And his gamble paid off. The weakened Delhi Sultanate, beset with problems on all sides, was no longer able to project its power south of the Vindhya Mountains, and it did nothing to stop him. This newly independent power had to fight for its survival from its first days. After defeating one local Hindu ruler, the Bahmani Sultanate received as tribute a magnificent gift, an ornate throne decorated with turquoise enamel that would become a symbol of their new empire, as the chronicler Farishta recalls.
The throne was in length 9 feet and 3 in breadth, made of ebony, covered with plates of pure gold, and set with precious stones of immense value. Every prince of the house of Bahmani who possessed this throne made a point of adding to it some rich stones. I learned that it was called the turquoise throne, from being partly enamelled of a sky colour, which was in time totally concealed by the number of jewels.
This would become known as the turquoise throne of the Bahmanis, and it would become a symbol of Muslim power in the south of India. Above this throne they affixed an umbrella, which the scholar Farishta also gushes about.
He fixed a golden ball set with jewels, on which was a bird of paradise composed of precious stones, at the top of the umbrella. On the bird's head was a ruby, inestimable in value, which had been presented to the late Sultan by the king of Vijayanagara.
When this first Sultan of the Bahmanis died, with his last words he declared that his son Muhammad Shah Bahmani would take his throne, and he entreated his sons to stand united and build a kingdom that would stand the test of time, as the chronicler Farishta writes.
I conjure you, as you value the performance of this kingdom, to agree with each other. Muhammad is my successor. Esteem submission and loyalty to him as your duty in this world, and yours surely for happiness in the next.
The Bahmani Sultanate was a powerful Muslim kingdom in the heart of South India that would last for the best part of the next 2 centuries. And for the Hindu people of Vijayanagara, it represented a constant, looming threat on their border. Historians in India and in the West who subscribe to a nationalist idea of history have often framed the conflict between these 2 medieval kingdoms in terms of a clash of cultures. In this conception of history, they imagine the Hindu kingdom of Vijayanagara as a bastion, defending Hindu culture from Islamic invaders. But there's little evidence to be found that the people or the rulers of Vijayanagara thought of the situation in this way. One inscription from the time of the Sangama brothers celebrates the victories of the Vijayanagara king Bukkaraya, and in it we can see that they thought of the Turkic Bahmani Sultanate as just one of the many enemies that the kingdom of Vijayanagara faced, and its other enemies were all Hindu kingdoms.
When his sword began to dance on the battlefield, the faces of the Turks shriveled up. Konkaya Sankapara was filled with fear. The Andhras ran into caves. The Gurjaras lost the use of their limbs on every road. The Kamboyas' courage was broken. The Kalingas suffered defeat.
Here there is no mention of religion, and neither is there any hint that the Muslim Bahmanis were any more despicable to the kings of Vijayanagara than, say, the Hindu kings of Kalinga on the east coast. There's little evidence that the kings of Vijayanagara thought of themselves as defending Hinduism, and indeed the idea of a unified Hindu identity simply didn't exist in the 14th century. While the 2 powers did fight long and bitter wars, the kings of Vijayanagara fought equally bitter wars with the Hindu Gajapatis, whose kings ruled over the humid, elephant-filled forest regions to the east. And when religious divisions emerged within the kingdom of Vijayanagara, it was overwhelmingly between the followers of Vishnu and Shiva among the Hindus, or between Hindus and Jains. In fact, conflicts between the Bahmani sultans and Vijayanagara often occurred due to greatly practical economic matters, like access to resources, supply lines, and trade routes. One bitter issue of contention was a rich tract of land between them, known as the Raichur Doab. This was a triangle of land formed at the point where the rivers Krishna and Tungabhadra met, and it was immensely fertile. But it also held great deposits of iron and even diamonds. Other conflicts would break out over the rich river deltas to the east and the western coast of India, home to rich trading ports. These ports controlled traffic by sea with the Muslim world and were a crucial conduit for the most important strategic military supply of the time, the powerful war horses imported from Arabia, Persia, and Central Asia. With these contentious territorial issues always on the minds of their rulers, wars between the Bahmani Sultanate and Vijayanagara broke out constantly. With their connections to the Muslim world, the Bahmanis had the advantage for much of this region's history. Well supplied with horses, the Sultan of the Bahmanis became known as Ashvapati, or the Lord of Horses, while the kings of Vijayanagara were known as Narapati, or the Lord of Men, alluding to their armies made up of largely massed infantry. The king of the Hindu Gajapatis in the east, with their vast stables of elephants, completed the triangle and became known as the Lord of Elephants. The Portuguese visitor Domingo Paes was suitably impressed by the infantry of Vijayanagara when he saw them marching in procession in the year 1520.
The troops on foot are so many that they surrounded all the valleys and hills in a way with which nothing in the world can compare. At the waist they have swords and small battle axes, and in their hands javelins with the shafts covered with gold and silver. You will see amongst them dresses of such rich cloths that I do not know where they came from, nor could anyone tell you how many colors they have. Shield men with their shields, with many flowers of gold and silver on them. Others with figures of tigers and other great beasts. Others, all are covered with silver leaf work, beautifully wrought.
But in the early days, they were no match for the horsepower of the Bahmani Sultanate. And with their connections to the vibrant intellectual world of Muslim learning, the Bahmanis also enjoyed a technological advantage. One of the first sultans, Muhammad Shah Bahmani, was a keen follower of new technologies. He even established gunpowder factories in the Sultanate to make use of the emerging technology. Gunpowder had first been introduced to India and the Middle East by the Mongols, who had learned about it from the Chinese. At this point, it was used mostly to create burning or exploding projectiles to be fired from catapults, and occasionally to create crude rockets. But soon experiments would begin in using it to propel heavy projectiles along metal tubes, first as siege weapons, and then as weapons on the battlefield. Soon the sounds of cannon fire would ring out over the battlefields of medieval India, and the Bahmani Sultan's early adoption of this technology would put them in a strong position in the coming centuries. So although the Hindus of Vijayanagara were the larger and often wealthier kingdom, they often found themselves in the position of paying tribute to their Muslim neighbours to the north, whose powerful cavalry armies, soon backed by the technological might of cannons, gave them the upper hand. But these wars were never true wars of conquest. The two powers would fight over a seaport, or the rich diamond mines of Raichur between them. But when the war's result became clear, the loser would inevitably sue for peace, agree to pay an enormous sum of money to the victor, often hand over one of their daughters in marriage, and then they would both return home. There was never any suggestion that one side in this rivalry would ever conquer and consume the other. Still, the growing power of the Bahmanis was of growing concern to the kings of Vijayanagara. Soon the Bahmani Sultanate stretched right across India from east coast to west, an unbroken belt that walled off the people of Vijayanagara to the north, that seized the rich lands of Raichur, and meant that the Hindus of the south were forever looking with fearful eyes to their northern borders. But despite these concerns, the city of Vijayanagara grew with astonishing speed. From the mid-14th century, the capital of Vijayanagara grew steadily, from the centre of a wealthy kingdom into a great world capital. Thanks to developments in water management in the countryside, the population boomed. Enormous work teams would have dug new irrigation systems and reservoirs lined with stone, as well as distinctive step wells, so that its people could draw water up from the earth. The city expanded rapidly, sprawling to absorb villages and towns around it, and soon grew to house as many as 300,000 people, at a time when London had only a fifth of that population, and when the largest city in Europe was Paris, with little more than 200,000. By the year 1500, Vijayanagara was the world's second largest medieval city, after Beijing, and probably India's richest. One poet alive at the time of the city's flourishing wrote the following ode to its beauty.
Walk around the great city of victory. Go where you will on city streets. Everywhere you walk, bright assembly halls decked out with golden vessels will dazzle your eyes. On many streets, homes with mirrored doors will shine, and sugarcane and plantain all around will invite you with welcomes. You'll find able-bodied fighters and horses, elephants and riders. You'll smell aromas of camphor and musk from breasts of exquisite doe-eyed women. You will face gardens lush with enjoyments, precious stones and glowing gold, a city of wealth and glory gleaming. You'll agree that this magnificent city is the most enchanting place you've ever seen.
And the city also benefited from being surrounded by a seemingly inexhaustible amount of exceptional building material, in the form of the large granite boulders of Hampi's ancient terrain. Vijayanagara was truly a city of stone, with all its palaces and stables, its towers and walls, even the houses of its citizens, carved out of blocks of solid granite. An ambassador from the Timurid capital of Samarkand named Abdur Razak, working as an ambassador for the Persian king, passed through Vijayanagara in the year 1443, and by this time the city's skyline had grown impressive enough for him to give the following glowing report.
The city of Bidnagar is such that the pupil of the eye has never seen a place like it, and the ear of intelligence has never been informed that there existed anything to equal it in the world.
And Vijayanagara would continue to grow. By the early 16th century, some 50 years later, it would be home to as many as 500,000 people, and the Portuguese writer Domingo Paes was stunned to see the heights it had reached.
The size of the city cannot all be seen from one spot, but I climbed a hill whence I could see a great part of it. I could not see it all because it lies between several ranges of hills. What I saw from thence seemed to me as large as Rome, and very beautiful to the sight.
Payez was also impressed by the great abundance available in the markets of Vijayanagara.
Going forward, you have a broad and beautiful street, full of rows of fine houses and streets of sorts I've described, and it is understood that the houses belong to men rich enough to afford such. In this city live many merchants, and there you will find all sorts of rubies and diamonds and emeralds and pearls, and seed pearls and cloths, and every other sort of thing there is on the earth that you may wish to buy.
Vijayanagara was divided into a number of different districts, each with a unique character. Near the river was the area known today as the Sacred Center, so called because of the many large temples that can be found here. Here, the mighty Virupaksha temple still soars up to the sky, with its enormous carved gate tower known as a Gopuram. The streets here would have been full of the sounds of chanting hymns and the clanging of temple bells, the smoke of incense and the pleas of the faithful as they came to pray, to be healed, and to be closer to the gods. Many of these temples were so large that for tax purposes they were classed as towns in their own right. These enormous building complexes supported a huge cast of retainers and specialists, dancers and labourers, cooks and cleaners, as well as scholars, holy men and artists. Further south is what's been termed the urban core, a walled area of around 20 square kilometres that contains both houses and markets, as well as workshops, rest houses and other places of business, as the historian Atul Chandra Chatterjee recalls.
The great majority of the houses were naturally small and undistinguished, but among them scattered palaces, temples, public buildings, wide streets of shops shaded by trees, busy markets, and all the equipment of a great and wealthy city.
Here, the ruined remains of the city clearly show a great amount of religious diversity. Local temples here cater to the Jains, as well as Hindu temples, for both Vishnu and Shiva followers, and one area with a mosque. The Portuguese traveller Duarte Barbosa, arriving in Vijayanagara around the year 1501, gave the following vivid description of this district.
The houses are thatched, but are nonetheless very well built, and arranged according to occupations, in long streets with many open places. And the folk here are ever in such numbers that the streets and places cannot contain them. There is a great traffic and an endless number of merchants and wealthy men. The king allows such freedom that every man may come and go according to his creed, without suffering any annoyance and without inquiry whether he is Christian, Jew, Moor, or heathen.
Barbosa also pays particular attention to the smells that would have wafted through the air from the markets selling spices and perfumes.
Here also is used vermilion, saffron, rosewater, great store of opium, sandalwood, aloes wood, camphor musk, and scented materials. Likewise, much pepper is used here, which they bring from Malabar on donkeys and pack cattle.
Here we can imagine scenes of family life, children running in the streets, wood smoke billowing overhead. Men would gather here to play games of chance and strategy on street corners, chewing betel nuts and leaves, which are chewed across India for a mild stimulant effect. Women would talk in the shade of coloured awnings, cows wandering unhindered among the crowds, and groups of musicians playing on the streets. It's during this time in the Vijayanagara Empire that the distinctive form of Indian classical music, known as Carnatic music, was laid down. We're joined on this episode by the virtuoso of Carnatic music, Aruna Sairam, who has recorded a number of authentic Carnatic pieces, especially for this podcast. one of which you're listening to now. We can imagine the sounds of this music drifting over the streets and rooftops of Vijayanagara as the business of everyday life went on. The day of an average citizen would have started with a bath in a local bathhouse. Men and women had separate bathing places, which were available at different times of the day. After bathing, families would go to their local temple to give offerings and receive blessings for the day ahead. We can see the clothing worn by the people of Vijayanagara in the colourful 16th century murals that decorate the walls of temples to Shiva and Vishnu in the village of Lepakshi. They show women with strikingly varied skin tones, wearing saris in multiple ornate patterns drawn from different regions, with pearls in their hair. Other murals show noblemen hunting a boar through the forest, with their facial hair cut into refined beards, wearing kilt-like lower garments and jewelled necklaces. Turbans and other headdresses were popular headgear among the rich. Both men and women wore perfumes made of sandalwood, rosewater, flowers, civet, and musk. Shopkeepers in this part of the city and everywhere else would need to be constantly alert to the mischief of the monkeys that still live to this day in huge numbers in the region of Hampi, the red-faced rhesus macaques, and the silvery grey or Hanuman langas. Then, as now, these animals love nothing better than to slink along the rooftops in their troops, drop down from shop awnings, and steal food from whoever has let down their guard. Towering over this bustling residential district was the royal centre. This was an area of walled enclosures that guard the large monumental palaces and mansions that were home to the city's wealthy elite. And it's clear that while they were Hindu, these city elites had a great deal of admiration for their Muslim rivals to the north. In these spacious houses, the architecture clearly shows a blend of Indian and Islamic styles. Some wall paintings in Vijayanagara even show the court wearing clothing in the style of their Muslim neighbours for formal events, tall caps and flowing gowns. Outside the walls of the city, the surrounding countryside was divided into a lacework of roads and fields, joining villages and larger towns that all provided grains like rice and millet, as well as squashes, gourds and other vegetables to the great city itself, brought in enormous quantities by bullock carts that would have filled the roads with a thick traffic. The perspectives of historians on Vijayanagara vary greatly, and in the past has caused huge disagreements, often among historians who may be approaching the evidence from a nationalist perspective or from a colonial or post-colonial perspective. Some of this is down to the differing ideologies of these historians. But the Vijayanagara Empire was a place of paradoxes and contrasts. On one hand, its rulers clearly modelled themselves on the old Hindu South Indian empires of the past. One clear example is in the temples they built, which drew inspiration from ancient Hindu empires like the Chalukyas, the Pandyas and the Cholas. These buildings were designed to reinforce the empire's connection to the Hindu powers of the past. But in many other ways, it was also a surprisingly radical experiment. A hybrid culture that took Hindu traditions and married them with an outward and forward-looking desire for new influences from the Muslim world and beyond. The world of medieval India was fast-moving and competitive, and those kingdoms that fell behind often didn't last long. One king of Vijayanagara in particular, named Devaraya II, was all too aware of this. He was determined to modernize and hybridize the empire of Vijayanagara and end the days of it paying tribute to the powerful Muslim kingdoms to the north. And to do this, he would open the empire's doors to the world. Devaraya II came to the throne in the year 1432 as a boy of only 8 years old. One Persian visitor to his court, who arrived at about 8 years later, gives the following description of the teenage king.
The king was dressed in a robe of green satin. Around his neck he wore a collar composed of pearls of beautiful water and other splendid gems. He was of an olive colour, of a spare body, and rather tall. He was exceedingly young, for there was only some slight down upon his cheeks, and none upon his chin. His whole appearance was very prepossessing.
And this young king, Devaraya, was determined to turn his empire into a modern, outward-looking state. To do this, he sent out word to the Muslim world that the doors of his kingdom were now open. Courtiers into his kingdom and enlisted as many as 200 Muslim officers into his army, as the scholar Farishta recalls.
Devaraya gave orders to enlist Muslims in his service, allotting them estates and erecting a mosque for their use in Vijayanagara. He also commanded that no one should molest them in exercise of their religion, and moreover, he ordered a Quran to be placed before his throne on a rich desk, so that the faithful might perform the ceremony of obeisance in his presence without sinning against their Lord.
Some carvings on the great temples of the city show Muslims taking part in its daily life, showing Arab horse handlers taking care of their steeds. And columns in the great Vitala temple show Muslim horse riders wearing turbans, rearing up on the backs of powerful imported horses. The borders of Vijayanagara were now guarded by large forces of Muslim cavalry, mercenaries paid from the vast coffers of the empire, and to these would soon be added units of Portuguese and Muslim gunners trained in the use of muskets. This influx of newcomers would change the nature of Vijayanagara's military, bringing advanced modern battle strategies and the increased use of cavalry. And it would have changed the fabric of the city itself. Devaraya II also engaged in large-scale infrastructure projects, digging large networks of canals that expanded the agricultural potential of the land around the city. The metropolis boomed to even greater size, and the Persian ambassador Abdur Razak was so impressed by the city when he visited in the year 1443 that he gave the following incredible account of the bustling life of the city's markets.
From the third to the seventh fortress, shops and bazaars are loosely crowded together. By the palace of the king there are 4 bazaars, situated opposite to one another. At the head of each bazaar there is a lofty arcade and magnificent gallery, but the palace of the king is loftier than all of them. The bazaars are very broad and long, so that the sellers of flowers are able to sell flowers from both sides. Sweet-scented flowers are always procurable fresh in that city.
Even travelling from the wealthy Silk Road city of Samarkand, Abdur Razak was struck by the obvious wealth of the citizens of Vijayanagara.
This country is so well populated that it is impossible in a reasonable space to convey an idea of it. In the king's treasury there are chambers with excavations in them filled with molten gold, forming one mass. All the inhabitants of the country, whether high or low, even down to the artificers of the bazaar, wear jewels and gilt ornaments in their ears and around their necks, arms, wrists and fingers.
Abdur Razak was especially struck by the vast stone elephant stables, which can still be seen in the ruins of Vijayanagara today.
Opposite the minister's office are the elephant sheds. The king has many elephants in the country, but the large ones are especially reserved for the palace. The king has a white elephant, exceedingly large, with here and there as many as 30 spots of colour. Every morning this animal is brought into the presence of the monarch, for to cast an eye upon him is thought a favourable omen. Each has a separate stall. The walls are very strong and high, and are covered with strong wood.
And he gives a clearly quite bashful account of the city's apparently thriving red light district.
Opposite the mint is the office of the prefect of the city, to which it is said 12,000 policemen are attached, and their pay, which equals each day 12,000 fanams, is derived from the proceeds of the brothels. The splendour of those houses, the beauty of the heart-ravishers, their blandishments and ogles, are beyond all description. It is best to be brief on the matter.
Finally, he was brought in to meet the King Devaraya, who at that point would have been around the age of 19. Perhaps most illuminating about this meeting is how many questions the Hindu king asked his Muslim visitor. He bombarded the Persian ambassador with inquiries about the great Muslim powers of the world, how many horsemen the king of Persia had under his command, what his great nobles were like, and how they behaved. He asked many questions about the great cities of Herat and Shiraz, and it's clear from this the curiosity and fascination he held for the Muslim world. But being the king of a medieval kingdom like Vijayanagara could be a dangerous business. Devaraya sat at the top of a towering and fragile hierarchy, packed with jealous rivals. While the Persian ambassador Abdur Razak was staying in the city, Devaraya II was the target of one particularly dramatic and audacious assassination attempt by one of his brothers, which shows just how dangerous the life of a king could be. This brother of King Devaraya plotted to first slaughter all the high-ranking officials in his government, before finally heading to the royal chambers and killing the king himself. The first part of the plan went off without a hitch, as Abdur Razak writes.
The king's brother, who had had a new house built for himself, invited thither the monarch and the principal personages of the empire. At short intervals, the prince either came in person or sent some messengers to say that such and such great personage should come and eat his part of the banquet. Care had been taken to bring together all the drums, kettle drums, trumpets and flutes that could be found in the city, and these instruments playing all at the same time made a tremendous uproar. As soon as the individual who had been sent for entered the above-mentioned house, 2 assassins placed in ambush sprang out upon him, pierced him with a dagger and cut him to pieces. In consequence of the noise of the drums, the clamour and the tumult, no one, with the exception of a small number to whom the secret was entrusted, was aware of what was going on. In this manner, all those who had any name or rank in the state were slaughtered.
Once his grisly work was done, the treacherous brother went to the king's quarters to strike the final blow of his coup. He entered the royal chamber with a plate of betel nuts and leaves for the king to chew, but beneath these leaves he had concealed a hidden blade. Coming close to the king, the brother told him that the court was ready for him, and offered him some of the betel. But perhaps the king had detected something strange in the way his brother stepped towards him. He declined, saying that he didn't feel well that day. Abdur Razak recalls what happened next, as the treacherous brother lost his patience.
This unnatural brother, thus losing the hope of enticing the king to his house, drew his poignard and struck him therewith several violent blows, so that the prince fell at the back of his throne. The traitor, thus believing that the king was dead, left there one of his confidants to cut off the monarch's head. Then, going out of the hall, he ascended to the portico of the palace and thus addressed the people. "I have slain the king, his brothers and such emirs, Brahmins and viziers. Now I am king."
But he had not counted on the king's resilience. As the treacherous brother's accomplice approached King Devaraya to decapitate him, the king fought back in dramatic fashion.
Meanwhile, his emissary had approached the throne with the intention of cutting off the king's head. But that prince, seizing the seat behind which he had fallen, struck the wretch with it with so much violence on the chest that he fell upon his back. The king then, with the help of one of his guards, slew this assassin and went out of the palace by the way of the harem. His brother, still standing on the top of the steps of the Hall of Council, invited the multitude to recognize him as their king. At that moment the monarch cried out, "I am alive! I am well and safe! Seize that wretch!" The whole crowd assembled together, threw themselves upon the guilty prince and put him to death.
This dramatic episode gives us a sense of the life and death stakes that the emperors of Vijayanagara faced every day. And the kings who followed Devaraya II were not always as lucky as he was. The great king Devaraya finally died in the year 1446. His reign had been a golden age. He had left his kingdom a larger, wealthier and more outward-looking place than he had found it. But the period that followed was one of chaos and dissolution in the empire. Devaraya's son is said quite mysteriously to have died of a broken heart, which is perhaps a euphemism for poison. His grandson took the throne, but would go on to be murdered by his own son. In a Shakespearean turn, this great-grandson of Devaraya was apparently horrified by what he had done and refused to take up the throne he had murdered his father for. He passed it on to one of his younger brothers, who quickly had him put to death. As blood ran in torrents from the throne, chaos began to engulf the empire, and soon the commanders of the military began to hunger for power themselves. One of these was a powerful general named Saluva Narasimha, a name that means man-lion. This general was a colourful character, a poet and a self-styled expert in lovemaking. In the year 1485, he seized the throne in a military coup and ended the Sangama dynasty that had ruled for 150 years, since the first days of Vijayanagara and the two Sangama brothers, Bukka and Harihara, who had founded it. The libidinous general Saluva Narasimha didn't seem to care much for the boring business of actually ruling his kingdom. He spent much of his time apparently writing a long book of detailed erotic instruction, but he died only a few years after taking the throne. It's during this period of chaos and the reign of the hapless kings that followed that in the year 1498, the first Portuguese ship, captained by the explorer Vasco da Gama, arrived in South India, having sailed all the way around the coast of Africa. He would be the first European captain to ever do so, but he would be followed by many others. The Portuguese would soon set up a trading post at Goa on India's west coast, and in the coming centuries, European powers would increase their presence and influence in India. But at the time, the appearance of these foreigners excited little attention in the court of Vijayanagara. This time of chaos and upheaval in the empire would only come to an end with the reign of a man who would come to be known as one of the greatest and certainly the most famous of the emperors of South India. He was a man named Krishnadeva Raya, the last great king of Vijayanagara. Krishnadeva was never meant to be the king. He was a prince, but his mother was a lower-ranking woman than any of his other brothers, and so his older brothers, Imadi and Viranarasimha, each took a turn at the throne before he did. But they catastrophically mismanaged the kingdom and faced constant rebellions and uprisings. When Krishnadeva's older brother finally lay on his deathbed, he was determined that his own infant grandson should take the throne, but he knew that many of the lords backed his brother Krishnadeva. In a final dying wish, he ordered that his brother should be blinded, which under Indian law would mean he could not become king. According to legend, the king's servants had no confidence in his baby son actually taking the throne, but they were still afraid to anger the dying king. In a daring move, they brought him the eyes of a recently slaughtered goat, still dripping with blood, and told him that his wishes had been carried out. The king died, satisfied that his line was secure, and Krishnadeva effortlessly took the throne. The Portuguese traveller Domingo Paes gives the following account of the appearance of King Krishnadeva.
The king is of medium height and of fair complexion and good figure, rather fat than thin. He has on his face signs of smallpox. He is the most feared and perfect king that could possibly be, cheerful of disposition and very merry. He is one that seeks to honor foreigners and receives them kindly, asking about all their affairs, whatever their condition may be. He is a great ruler and a man of much justice, but subject to sudden fits of rage, and this is his title: King of Kings, Lord of great lords of India, Lord of the 3 seas and of the land.
Krishnadeva Raya was also what we might think of today as a fitness fanatic. Domingo Paes writes the following account of his daily routine.
The king is accustomed every day to drink a 3/4 pint of sesame oil before daylight and anoints himself all over with the same oil. He covers his loins with a small cloth and takes in his arms great weights made of earthenware, and then, taking a sword, he exercises himself with it till he has sweated out all the oil, and then he wrestles with one of his wrestlers. After this labor, he mounts a horse and gallops about the plain in one direction and another till dawn, for he does all this before daybreak.
And Krishnadeva showed a similar energetic attitude to his rule. One of his first acts was to embark on a campaign against the troublesome Lord of Elephants, the king of the Gajapatis in the east. He marched his armies into that humid forest region and seized important forts along the way. King Krishnadeva was a poet, and he wrote the following words in his epic poem Amuktamaliyada about his campaign against the Gajapatis in the east.
In the blue hills of Puri, under the protective gaze of blue-robed Balram and Lord Krishna, whose eyes are like blue water lilies, I prepared for battle and struck fear into the Gajapati's heart with my powerful arms pounding the drums of war.
The Gajapati king eventually surrendered, and in a classic example of conflict resolution in this period, he offered his daughter in marriage to Krishnadeva, who returned all the coastal territory back to the now humbled Gajapatis. This victory must have boosted his reputation at home and fed what was apparently an enormous ego. Krishnadevaraya's royal inscriptions gush with self-praise.
Overcome by his glory, the sun sinks into the western ocean, as if quite unable to endure the distress of mind, as if fearing that the 7 oceans would provide a refuge to his enemies. They were dried up by the clouds of dust raised by the earth, trampled to pieces by his horsemen.
But Krishnadeva was also an eminently practical man. He published a series of political maxims that contained advice for how a kingdom should be ruled, how it should operate efficiently, and secure its access to resources, as the following example written by him shows.
A king should improve the harbours of his country, and so encourage its commerce, that horses, elephants, precious gems, sandalwood, pearls, and other articles are freely imported.
Under King Krishnadeva, the Vijayanagara Empire nearly doubled in size and would soon reach its largest historical extent, and it would also achieve its greatest degree of centralization. At heart, it was still a feudal society, and its regions were ruled by lords known as Nayakas. These Nayakas paid taxes to the empire, but otherwise enjoyed a degree of independence, as the Portuguese visitor Domingo Paes recalls.
These captains who he has over these troops of his are the nobles of his kingdom. They are lords, and they hold the city and the towns and villages of the kingdom. There are captains amongst them who have a revenue of 1 million and 1.5 million of pardeos. Others 100,000 pardeos. Others 200, 300, or 500,000 pardeos. And as each one has revenue, so the king fixes for him the number of troops he must maintain, in foot, horse, and elephants. These troops are always ready for duty, whenever they may be called out, and wherever they may have to go. Besides maintaining these troops, each captain has to make his annual payments to the king.
Krishnadeva was also a great builder. To mark his coming to the throne, in 1510 he ordered the construction of a grand gateway tower, known as a Gopura, to adorn the temple of Virupaksha, as well as a central pillared hall covered in ornate carvings. This remarkable temple tower was designed based on mathematical principles, using a fractal design in which small parts of the tower resemble the whole. This gives the tower a mesmerizing shape and represents the infinite repetition of universes that lies at the heart of Hindu cosmology, as the scholar William J. Jackson describes.
The ideal form, gracefully artificed, suggests the infinite rising levels of existence and consciousness, expanding sizes rising towards transcendence above, and at the same time housing the sacred deep within.
For the nearby Vitala temple, Krishnadeva also commissioned a striking piece of art to be carved out of several blocks of granite. It was a temple chariot made of stone, complete with wheels and ornate decorations, which can still be seen in the courtyard of the Vitala temple in Hampi today. This was a true golden age in South India, a time of peace, stability, and prosperity, but this period of calm would not last. In fact, Krishnadeva would be the last great king of Vijayanagara. In little more than 50 years, this vast city would be destroyed, its temples and palaces burned, its streets emptied of people, and its houses left to crumble into the earth. And the beginning of the downfall of Vijayanagara began with an event that to its people must have felt like a fantastic development. That's the fragmentation and collapse of their long-standing rival to the north, the Muslim Bahmani Sultanate. Like the Empire of Vijayanagara, the Bahmani Sultanate had been successful by combining disparate elements. For decades, they had been enthusiastically importing people from across the Muslim world: soldiers, architects, artists, holy men, and scholars. And these people had helped to transform it into a world centre of culture and innovation. But this policy also had its costs. Soon, conflicts began to unfold between the Indian Bahmanis and the newcomers, mostly Persian-speaking Iranians, who were referred to as the Westerners. Throughout the 15th century, the Indian Muslims in the Sultanate became increasingly angry at the growing influence of these foreign arrivals. And as the 16th century neared, their anger turned mutinous. When the enraged ruler of Ahmednagar rebelled in the year 1490, the other regions of the Sultanate soon followed. By the time Krishnadeva came to the throne of Vijayanagara in the year 1509, the Bahmani Sultanate was already splintering. By the year 1518, it had fractured into 5 individual kingdoms, whose sultans immediately began fighting amongst themselves over small pieces of land. The power of the Bahmanis evaporated in just a matter of years, and Vijayanagara was now all but unchallenged in the south of India. For King Krishnadeva, still only a young man of 17 years old, and still buzzing from his victory against the Gajapatis, the chaos in these neighbouring kingdoms presented an obvious opportunity. That rich triangle of land known as the Raichur Doab, with its fertile farmland and wealth of diamonds, had been in the hands of the Bahmanis for many years now. But with the collapse of the Sultanate, it was now held by just one of these 5 sultans, a man named Ismail Adil Shah, the Sultan of Bijapur. Alone, he would be no match for the might of Vijayanagara, and so in the year 1520, King Krishnadeva moved to take it from him with an army of 100,000 soldiers. The Portuguese Jewish traveller Fernão Nunes was staying in Vijayanagara at the time of this campaign, and he wrote a dramatic and colourful account of how it unfolded.
After the king had made his offerings and performed sacrifices to his idols, he left the city of Bisnagar with all his troops, and they marched in the following order. The chief of the guard led the advance with 30,000 infantry, archers, men and shields and musketeers and spearmen, and 1,000 horse and his elephants. All were equally well armed, each after his own fashion, the archers and musketeers with their quilted tunics, and the shieldmen with their swords and daggers in their girdles.
In the days that followed, King Krishnadeva marched this large army across the Tungabhadra River and laid siege to the fort of Raichur. But this would not be as easy as Krishnadeva hoped. The kings of Vijayanagara had still not taken advantage of the developing technology of the cannon, although they had employed several Portuguese musketeers as mercenaries. Raichur Fort was a powerful fortress, perched on top of a rocky hilltop, and without effective siege equipment, the Hindus resorted to old-fashioned tactics, hacking away at the fort walls with pickaxes and hammers. The defenders, meanwhile, were well stocked with cannons and rained down fire from the walls. These cannons did have one weakness. They were unable to fire directly downwards at the men with their pickaxes, hacking away at the masonry beneath. Still, they dealt a terrible toll on the besieging soldiers as they approached. The siege looked like it would last forever, But then one morning, Krishnadeva got word that the Sultan of Bijapur himself was marching south towards him at the head of an army. This army was made up of his best crack troops, equipped with nearly 1,000 of the latest powerful cannons, imported from Persia. Perhaps feeling just a tremble of apprehension, Krishnadeva lifted the siege and went out to meet the Sultan in battle. Fernão Nunes, who witnessed these two armies come together, describes in visceral terms the noise they made as they prepared to fight.
Seeing that dawn was now breaking, the drums and trumpets and other music in the king's camp began to sound and the men to shout, so that it seemed as if the sky would fall to the earth. Then the neighing and excitement of the horses and the trumpeting of the elephants. It is impossible for anyone to describe how it was. It would hardly be believed the great fear and terror that struck those who heard it, so that even those very men that caused the noise were themselves frightened at it. And the enemy on their part made no less noise, so that if you asked anything, you could not hear yourself speak, and you had to ask by signs, since in no manner could you make yourself understood.
This encounter, which has come to be known as the Battle of Raichur, is the perfect embodiment of the chaos and violence of a medieval battle. Although Vijayanagara had brought the larger army, the Sultan of Bijapur was confident that his superior firepower would scatter Hindus and bring him victory. When the battle began, he ordered his cannoneers to fire all of their guns at once in a devastating volley. Fernão Nunes recounts what happened next, as 1,000 cannonballs tore through the ranks of the Vijayanagara soldiers.
He commanded the whole of the artillery at once to open fire, which discharge, as it was very great, did much damage to the enemy, killing many of the horse and foot and many elephants. And it compelled the king, Krishnadeva's troops, to retire. As soon as the Moors saw their enemies beginning to leave the field, they charged all amongst them, slaughtering them for about half a league.
It looked like all was lost for Vijayanagara, but King Krishnadeva refused to admit defeat. He rallied his generals and elite cavalry around him and gave a stunning and quite ruthless order.
When the king saw the way in which his troops fled, he began to cry that they were traitors, and that he would see who was his side, and that since they all had to die, they should meet their fate boldly. "Who ranges himself with me?" he cried. Immediately there thronged about him all those lords and captains that were ready to side with him. Then he took a ring from his finger and gave it to one of his pages, so that he might show it to his queens in token of his death. Then he mounted a horse and moved forward with all his remaining divisions, commanding to slay without mercy every man of those who had fled.
According to this account, Krishnadeva and his generals began slaughtering their own fleeing men until they managed to make them turn and flee in the opposite direction. The pure crushing weight of these bodies, backed by as many as 27,000 horses, seems to have turned the tide back on the Muslim soldiers. The Sultan's cannons had all fired at once, and they all had to stop to reload at the same time, meaning that they were unable to summon another volley. While pursuing the fleeing men of Vijayanagara, the Sultan's men had abandoned their ranks, and when the enemy turned and pushed back, they found themselves in disarray. The fleeing rabbit had once again turned around and bitten its pursuer. Nunes breathlessly describes what happened next.
The confusion was so great amongst the Moors, and such havoc was wrought in their ranks, that they did not even try to defend the camp, they had made so strong and enclosed so well. But like lost men, they leapt into the river to save themselves. Then after them came large numbers of the king's troops and elephants, which latter worked amongst the mischief without end, for they seized men with their trunks and tore them into small pieces.
A final push by the elite troops of Vijayanagara drove the Sultan's entire army into the waters of the Krishna River, where a massacre began. The army of Bijapur was defeated, but at terrible cost. 16,000 of Krishnadeva's men had been killed in the battle, as Fernão Nunes recounts.
Here the king stayed till all the dead had been burnt, and the customary honours had been paid to them. And here he gave much alms for the souls of those who had been killed in battle on his side. Those numbered 16,000 and odd.
Krishnadeva now returned to the siege of the fort, and it's here that he seems to have employed the help of a company of Portuguese mercenaries, led by a captain named Cristóvão de Figueiredo. While Krishnadeva seems to have employed a limited number of soldiers with matchlock muskets in his army, these European mercenaries had brought with them the latest arquebuses. These long-barreled guns achieved an astonishing degree of accuracy for early firearms. Fernão Nunes writes an account of this final siege, and how this small group of Portuguese snipers tipped the balance in the battle for Raichur Fort, with either a very skillful or a very lucky shot.
Cristóvão de Figueiredo went close to the trench before the walls, keeping himself as much concealed as possible. And seeing how fearlessly the Moors exposed themselves on the wall, began, with the musketeers whom he had brought, to open fire on them in such a way that he slew many, the Moors being careless and free from fear. The captain of the city, seeing the dismay that had spread amongst his people, began to turn them back with encouraging words, and he, wishing to see for himself where the Portuguese were, reached over with his body in front of one of the embrasures and was killed with a musket shot that struck him in the middle of his forehead. As soon as the captain was thus killed, there was great lamentation in the city, and soon there was no one defending the wall.
Raichur Fort surrendered soon after. These rich lands now belonged to Vijayanagara, an accomplishment that many kings before had tried and failed to achieve. Krishnadeva was clearly overjoyed, but his victory had caused a ripple of concern among all the Muslim kingdoms of the region. Fernão Nunes recounts that the king soon received a number of diplomats, all carrying similar messages from the neighbouring sultans. They all warned him that he should not attempt to overreach. He should be content with his victory and not upset the natural balance of the region. With the hindsight that history gives us, we know that Krishnadeva should have taken this warning seriously, but he did not. Krishnadeva sent out the same reply to every one of the sultans, which Fernão Nunes recorded.
I have seen your letters, and thank you much for what you have sent to say. As regards Adil Shah, what I have done to him and taken from him, he has richly deserved. As regards returning it to him, that does not seem to me reasonable, nor am I going to do it. And as for your further statement, that you will all turn against me if I do not do as you ask, I pray you do not take the trouble to come to me, for I will come to find you myself if you dare to await me in your lands. And this I send you for answer.
In fact, the young Krishnadeva was so emboldened that he decided to do of for more than 100 years. That was to march north and seize the Sultan's capital city of Bijapur itself. Bijapur was one of the great cities of South India, and the largest and wealthiest in the lands that had once been part of the Bahmani Sultanate. It was a great centre of culture, trade and commerce, and was home to a great variety of gardens and water pavilions. One North Indian visitor to the city would later describe it in the following glowing terms.
All around the gate of my residence were lofty buildings with houses, very healthy and airy. Before each shop was a